Like a oops.
Sensor button.
Sorry about that.
7-second delay. All right.
We're in Romans.
Romans chapter 4. Remember, just to kind of do the building blocks here, Paul has made the case that everyone is equally unrighteous, equally in need, and that righteousness is not something that can be achieved through law, but something that has to be received through grace. We have just started unpacking that, and now Paul is going to utilize his familiarity with the Old Testament, and he's going to put what I think what was for his day a revolutionary spin on a story that all of his readers, the Jewish readers at least, would have known. So he's going back to the patriarch of the faith, Abraham, and we'll see what he does here. Verse 1 of chapter 4. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about before God, not before God. For what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. Let's stop there, Michael. So this is something that Paul's going to do. He's going to revisit this story of Abraham. And just to bring you up to speed, Abraham is credited as being kind of the foundation, the patriarch of the faith. And though the story reads a little differently, to be honest, Abraham gets credited for putting his trust and faith in God in this promise that God had given that looked very unlikely, that Abraham and Sarah would have a son. And if you wanted to say in the larger context, he puts his faith in God when he moves and when he does everything. But specifically, there's kind of this idea that he trusted God and that he is then rewarded for it. And Paul is going to argue that what Abraham receives is not what he deserves. He didn't earn it. He wasn't justified. He wasn't made righteous by his works, but by believing. He believed in God. He believed God, and it was counted to him as righteous. And this is probably a place where we could use an updated translation. Michael, the word reckoned is probably not in most of our daily speech, but the idea here is almost credited to him.
Yeah, so I think that now that we are really getting into the nitty-gritty of this idea of righteousness and being justified and why that matters in this Old Testament sort of context, you got to remember that this all stands upon that initial presumption or foundation that we are unrighteous and stand in need of righteousness. And if you have been with us this whole time, you know the amount of time that we started in this letter dealing with the idea of sinfulness. And this is where we start to see the implications of that now reflected in Paul's reading of the Old Testament, of the story of Israel, that Abraham fundamentally did stand in need of justification. He needed to be made right in the eyes of God because he, as a human, inherited all of the problems that humanity bears with it. And the way forward wasn't by completing works, by doing the thing that God told him to do. Ultimately, Paul wants to say that Abraham's faith in God, which is an intangible as opposed to the external reality, is the thing that is responsible for God conferring or giving righteousness to Abraham. And that makes sense when we think about wages, right? When you receive a paycheck, you receive it not because your employer is being gracious, though there's a sense in which they are. You receive it because you exchange time and work for payment. And in this case, Paul's saying we don't think of Abraham as having been paid righteousness for what he did, but rather God is graciously gifting righteousness and justification on God's own prerogative.
And we should probably, it may be helpful to think about the word works here, because as we have experienced the debate, faith and works, we tend to think of works as those good things that Christians do, tithing or compassion. But in this context, works for Paul is still very much tied to the Jewish understanding. So we're still talking things like circumcision. We're still talking things like the law. And I don't want us to be confused with our usage of the word, because he doesn't have yet in mind. He's going to get there, or at least he's going to overlap with that. But right now, it doesn't mean just good stuff that people do. It's specifically tied to Judaism, and we'll see that here in the rest of the passage. So verse 6, so David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. Is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised or also on the uncircumcised? We say faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How was it reckoned? Was it before or after he'd been circumcised? It was not after. It was before. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and all who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. And likewise, the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. So this is, a little bit of repetitive language, maybe not the easiest part of the book to follow. But what Paul is doing here in terms of his argument, he's essentially making the case, I think, that where it used to be thought of as one thing, there are now two. That it may have been historic that you simply talked about being circumcised or not, but Paul is talking about being justified or not, and he's arguing that that is a different question. And he's using, ironically, the core of the Judaism's faith, the man Abraham, the pioneer of the faith, to make his New Testament. So he's using the paradigm of the Old Testament to make his New Testament argument. And he's saying, look, this verse that faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness, so Abraham got righteousness. How did he do it? He did it through faith, and he did it before he was circumcised. So if righteousness comes around from the work or the law, Abraham has neither at this point. And yet, God says that he's counted as righteous because he believed. And for Paul, this is fundamental to his understanding. When the first time that Paul went back and reread this Abraham story through the lens of this theological argument, it had to be for him just a moment of unbelievable, it had to dawn on him, it had to just floor him that he had now put this in whole new terms.
Yeah, and what makes this dense reading here, Clint, is not only the repetitive nature of it or the terminology here, that all of the times that we're talked about circumcision, right? That's not a thing that we consider when we're having faith conversations. And what's happening here is Paul is engaging in some very substantial theological arguments. This is the section where when we talk about Romans, and we talk about how it's a significant standout theological work in the New Testament, what you see happening here is a combination of biblical interpretation, which I hear you, Clint, talking about this idea of revisiting the Old Testament in light of his understanding of Christ. But what you also have happening here is you have some racial ethnic conversations happening where Paul is using racial ethnic language for Judaism, and he's interpreting it theologically with radically different impact than it has had historically. And simultaneously, the subtext right now, it's going to be made explicit later, but we already have the subtext of what Paul's arguing, is that because of this radical new understanding of the thing that used to be assumed as to what it meant. Circumcision used to mean simple inclusion in God's covenant people. That's what it meant. Now Paul wants to say that it is merely an external marker, which is not as important as the internal marker, which is done by faith through Jesus Christ. And it is this really radical layering, I think you would say, building upon the layer that came before. Paul is working his way up to say, hey, here's the things that were assumed that we can no longer assume. And the implications of that new building that he's building theologically is going to be to make a very practical case to this congregation later. So if you feel like we're in the weeds and you sort of struggle for, well, what's the point here? This is building the case for the implications, which are in many ways world-changing. And so this is an important part of this book, if not, one that's really written for in our parlance or in a way that we might be able to resonate with immediately.
It might be helpful to be reminded that when you read the word circumcised in Paul's context, it's synonymous with Jewish. They're the only people doing that. The world around Paul is not circumcised. So circumcision that's almost a synonym for Jewish in this. Whenever he's talking about people who are circumcised, you can read that in the context of the New Testament as Jewish, and maybe that helps. It's to try and push it, Michael, and this gets a little cloudy, so help me here if I hit a wall. But our mark is different. Our mark, if Christians were going to say that we had a physical mark of inclusion, we would talk about the sacrament of baptism. But if we were to argue that one is made righteous because they are baptized, we would be leaving our understanding of baptism very quickly. We would never argue that one is made righteous or holy or godly because you are baptized. In fact, it's supposed to work the other way around. Because we realize the righteousness that God has given us in Christ, we respond by presenting ourselves or our children to be baptized. But the baptism is not the thing that redeems us. Jesus redeems us, and our baptism is a sign of that. And this is, I think, to some extent, what Paul is trying to argue is that circumcision is not the thing, but it points to the thing. It's connected to the thing. It expresses the thing, but the thing is the grace of Jesus Christ, and that is new for him. And to try and work backwards and put that into this practice of circumcision and say it now has a meaning that we previously didn't understand. Now, I won't say it's a new meaning, but only now do we understand what it truly means, and it doesn't mean what we thought it did.
Two quick things. One, if you were a young Jewish child and you were asked to interpret the story of what Abraham means, and you gave this answer, you failed. You failed the test. This is a radical departure from what the Jewish interpretations of Abraham was. And I think what's instructive in this, friends, is we're beginning to see how Paul reads his own scriptures. And this is significant. When Paul looks backward at what he would call the Bible, this is long before Romans became known as our scriptures. When he's writing this and he's reading his scriptures, what Paul sees is that God has an intention that reaches beyond these people. And that's the part of the story that isn't lifted up in Paul's Jewish context. In other words, what Paul is saying here is, hey, we know that this is true because Jesus died, because we see that God was intending to open this beyond, that we can look back and now see through the lens of hindsight of what God was doing with Abraham there. In other words, the promise that we thought God had made to Abraham, we only understood in part. Now we understand in greater measure that God had intended even more through that promise than what we had calculated. And Clint, I think if that's going to lift something out, we can already anticipate the human reaction to that kind of argument, because anyone who's human and says, hey, wait a minute, I thought that was for us. Wait, no, Paul. We are the favored ones here. No, we're not going to go back, and the story's not bigger. The story is what it was. There's a sense in which I think it's always hard. It's part of our human condition to look back and to, first of all, admit when we were wrong, but second of all, to see when the story is bigger and more expansive than what we imagined, we often feel left out. And Paul's addressing that concern here to say, hey, listen, it was bigger. And he's going to actually later, there's going to be some chapters that will be really interesting to talk about together, where he addresses that concern, hey, we feel left out. And we'll bring that up again when we get there. But needless to say, this is a diversion from what would be considered standard interpretation in Paul's day, and we should know that when we're reading it.
So many of these passages suffer from the fact that we're familiar with where they end up, and as we inherit a tradition that has built so much of its theology on these kind of arguments, they don't seem surprising to us. But this is new for Paul. And to give Paul credit, I think it matters that rather than simply saying, well, look, the story of Abraham is old news. Jesus is here now. We don't, it matters that Paul, through the lens of Jesus, revisits his own tradition and finds Jesus in it. And this is important because there were people in Paul's day and many later who wanted to say, if we have the Jesus story, the Jewish story doesn't matter.
Right.
We start fresh with the Jesus story. And Paul is saying, no, God's story, the Jesus story, has always been the Jewish story. We just didn't know how to see him in it. We didn't know how to understand and discern him in it, but now we do. And I think you have to give Paul credit for being willing to revisit these sacred texts of Judaism and say, hey, let me show you some things that I think you missed that we now understand because of Christ. And I know that maybe for those of us who grew up being taught, we all know we're saved through faith. We all know grace. We all know faith versus works. We learned that when we were 5, when we were 10. We've heard it in sermons and read it and studied it. But in Paul's context, it's new. And it's hard to overstate how pioneering this is and how amazing it is that Paul is able to follow these suggestions where they ultimately take him.
And that he's got the gall to write it to people he hasn't personally met.
Yeah, very much.
Friends, that's a good place to summarize. I think that's a good last word, Clint. We will look forward to seeing you all as we continue together next Monday.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, We hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.